False adventure seems to be so alluring and intoxicating in so many ways. And naturally, in the case that you're sharing, distracting as well. How does one avoid the allurements of a false adventure while they're still pursuing and uncovering?
That's a very good question. Well, I think conscience is a big part of that, because it's very frequent that people will be visited by their conscience when they do something that's hedonistically valuable in the short term. But then they think, oh, I shouldn't have done that. It's like, well, why shouldn't have you done that? Well, I cheated on my girlfriend. All right, well, you got to cheat. There's the benefit. What's the downfall? Well, I can't trust myself. I'm a liar. She can't trust me. Okay, so what's the problem with that? You want to be alone? You want to be a parasitical psychopath? Like, what's your goal here? And so part of the problem with just calling, let's say, is it can become short term and it can entice you into false micro adventures that don't propagate well across time and that disturb other people. You said something when we were talking just before the interview started about, because I was asking you what you thought you might be doing right with regard to your podcast, say, that would account for its popularity. And you said, well, you're in it for the long run. Well, a fundamental part of cortical maturation from a biological perspective is that you start to see things in the long run, and then you don't do things in the short term that are exciting and even adventurous that violate the propagation of the adventure across time. And you can envision it this way socially. If you and I have an honest conversation, okay, imagine that you have a guest who uses your podcast in a manipulative way. Okay, they could gain some short-term advantage, putting you down, let's say, playing a power game, using the podcast as a means to enhance their economic standing or their social standing. Well, what's the problem with that? Well, they're not going to get invited back. Well, you do that 20 times, you're done, right? Okay, so one of the ways of thinking about this, if you're trying to understand what constitutes morality, technically, is that the moral pathway, if I'm interacting with you morally, assuming you're treating yourself properly, our interactions are going to have to be of the kind that you want to voluntarily repeat. That's what you have with a friend. And there's a pattern to that, obviously, a pattern of reciprocity, a pattern of mutual aid, unless it's a pathological friendship, in which case it's likely to collapse anyways. But that's a constraint. Repeatability, voluntary repeatability across time is a real constraint. And it's something like the future, because it's across time, but it's also something like the constraint on your actions by the necessity for you to be embedded in a voluntary social framework, right? And that's a huge advantage. Like one of the things you could think about, for example, there's this game that economists play, behavioral economists. So this is how the game works. You pick two people and you say to one of them, I'm going to give you $100 and you have to split it with this person. If they accept the offer, then you get the 100 and you pay them. But if they refuse the offer, neither of you get anything. So that's the game. Now, if you play that across cultures, what you find is that regardless of socioeconomic status, people offer 50%. Okay, now this violates the tenets of classical economics, which views people as self-maximizers. Because if I'm only going to play a game with you once, I should take $99 and give you $1. And you should take $1 because, what, do you want 0 or do you want 1? But that isn't what people do. They split it 50-50. Now, then you might ask, why? Well, you don't play one-off games with people. So imagine you're doing this publicly. Okay, now everyone watches you and they see that you're a fair player. Well, then they're going to play with you if they get an opportunity. You could even say, I don't know if this has ever been tested, but you could even say, well, maybe you do a 60-40 split and you offer the person that's playing slightly more than you get. Well, you lose in that game, but if you get a reputation, that's part of that Abrahamic adventure. If you get a reputation for bending over backwards to be reciprocal, people are going to line up to play with you. And so that's why you try to teach your children to be good sports, because, you say to them, it doesn't matter whether you win or lose. It matters how you play the game. And the kid thinks, what the hell do you mean? Of course it matters if I win. You know, parents are usually not sophisticated enough to pursue that philosophically, but the right answer is, what good is there winning one game when you never get invited to play again? It's much better to be invited to play 100 games. And that means you're going to have to be the sort of person that other people are lining up to play with. And that's the basis. That's part of the basis of a genuine ethic. And I think raised to the philosophical level, you get something like a transcendent ethic out of that. It's biologically predicated, but it's a higher order. It's a higher order and more mature ethic, and it's real. It's super real.